Unfortunately, we are covering two Torah portions this week. And the first thing that I want to point out to you as I begin to paint with broad strokes regarding the book of Exodus is that we need to really think of the book of Exodus as introducing a new covenant. The book of Exodus is the new covenant. And I don't mean a picture of the new covenant that would be revealed through the Messiah Yeshua, although it does have that element as well. What I mean is that this is literally a new covenant that is given to the family of Jacob. We know that Abraham received a covenant. We know that Noah received a covenant. We know that Adam received a covenant. We know that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob received and were reiterated to the covenant. And that now this covenant is going to be expanded and built upon, new elements introduced. And so I want you to really begin to think about this as you read your Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Realize that these covenants, it's basically one gigantic covenant. It's not, this is the key point that I would say about this. We don't take one covenant and say, okay, that one's done, and now we're building a new one. And then now that one's done, we're going to set it aside and build a new one. And then that one's completed and we're going to build a new one. That's not the way it works. And I think that we often hear about the covenant between God and His people as a marriage relationship. You've heard that many times because it's a really good metaphor to explain this relationship between God and His people. And I think that that's a really good metaphor, but like all metaphors, it breaks down at some point. But I want to discuss just briefly with you the idea of the covenant, this continual covenant. And do you know that there's another covenant coming later?
Jeremiah.
Well, first of all, you got the whole idea that the covenant, the new covenant, that what we think of in our minds as the new covenant, and initiated by the advent of Yeshua, is not completely fulfilled yet, right? We still got some. He's got to return. The second half of the program is coming, and establishing the other half, I suppose you could say, of that covenant, 2,000 years in between. The really good stuff, yeah. And then what's going to happen after that 1,000-year period? We don't even know. There's undoubtedly probably some more development of this covenant. We'll know more later. Yeah, it's definitely new. But I want to explore with you just briefly about this development of the covenant. And take a look at this, okay? This developing relationship, think about it like this. If we just started at Abraham, for example, we have like a betrothal period with Abraham. A ring is given. A sign is given, which is what a sign is. It's like a ring in a marriage. It's a covenantal indicator. Okay, promises were made. He says, he initiates, the husband, God, initiates this relationship with Abraham and says, I want to have a relationship with you. And Abraham agrees. And a sign is given to indicate this covenant that is being established, this betrothal, this period of, what do we call it in our society?
Engagement.
An engagement. So what is the sign of that covenant? Circumcision is the sign of the betrothal covenant. Now, when you look at he calls Abraham and his descendants into this relationship, gives them this sign, like a promise ring of the circumcision. He gives them promises of a further redemption. Okay, so this is all laying it out. If you think about a betrothal period and a period of engagement, especially if you've heard about how the Hebrews in the days of Yeshua and prior to that performed an engagement ceremony where it's like once you become engaged, you're essentially married. You just haven't engaged in it's almost legally binding, but not quite. There's no physical intimacy. You're not dwelling together, but you're firmly attached. And the woman stays in the man's home until the bridegroom shows up, generally with a trumpet blast you've probably heard, to call his bride out of her father's house. They have a wedding feast. I mean, you see this picture in the New Testament talking about when Yeshua will return. And you can see that here in just a second. I'm going to develop that a little further.
Marriage is like a covenant, right?
Yes.
And, okay, you're married. Let's say the betrothal part is like being married without the benefits of marriage. Okay, then when you do get married, you have your marriage ceremony and all that. 9 months later, a year or two later, a kid comes along. Now you've got to do paperwork and all that stuff. So you're renewing the covenant or you're revising the covenant. So everything that you do, even in that married life, is like a revision or a renewal to the covenant.
It absolutely
But it's
is.
Still the same marriage.
Absolutely. It's like addendums. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a good insight, Jerry. Thank you. Now, once you get past the betrothal period, is where you see the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt. This is where you see the marriage. And I know that you have heard about the people coming out of Egypt and going to the mountain. And it's interesting that when it says that they come to the mountain, that they're under the mountain. It literally says that in the Hebrew. And the rabbis have said, well, the mountain is like a chuppah, that these people are getting married. And God says, I will. And the people say, we will. And there's a marriage covenant happening between these people and God. So this metaphor keeps building and growing. And he gives them another wedding ring this time, another sign of this covenant. What is this sign?
Could be the Ten Commandments.
Not quite.
No.
What does he say is a sign? A sign between me and my people. Tracy? The Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is a sign. So we started off with the sign of circumcision. We're now moving to the sign. The real ring is, the marriage ring is given, and it is the covenant of the Sabbath. This is how they're sealing this new agreement. Now, I want you to think about this. If the physical aspects don't engage until the marriage actually takes place in a ceremony, then you can look at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai as the physical rules of engagement. The physical rules of engagement. Now, that's because, unfortunately, you all know, because many of you in here are married. In fact, you've either married or been married. It starts off oftentimes with a physical attraction. I mean, you're not going to date or become connected to someone unless you're physically attracted to them. And you get married and you engage in sexual relations. And I think that if your experience is anything like mine, and most people that I have spoken to regarding marriage, and it's been a number of them over the years, the marriage relationship develops from being physical to being spiritual. That physical intimacy is a strong foundation of the marriage in the initial years. And that if you're growing in your marriage at all, you're hopefully moving away from just having a purely physical relationship to having a more spiritual one as you begin to get to know each other's souls and begin to learn to place the other person's interests ahead of your own. Then the physical aspects of the relationship evolve into spiritual aspects. But even those physical aspects evolve. They're the same principles, they just evolve to a higher level. And so when you see this marriage covenant of the nation of Israel, it's like seeing the physical rules of engagement with how God is going to interact with these people, with his people. Now you move forward another period of time, almost 2,000 years, and you get to this spiritual development that I spoke of, where my Torah will be upon your heart, where Yeshua initiates the next phase, the next development of this covenant, where we take things to a spiritual level. I know that you have read all of Matthew chapters 5 and 6 and 7, where he is giving the deeper spiritual meaning of the Torah, where he says, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. He's taking you to the next level. He's saying, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, because he's taking you to the next deeper level. Now, like I said a moment ago, what's next? Something. We're not even entirely sure about the next phase of development of the New Testament. The renewed, the expanded covenant that was brought together under Yeshua. Those elements have been a little bit shrouded in mystery even to this day. That there's a lot of speculation about what's it going to look like exactly when the second half of this covenant is developed. We're not entirely certain.
I think the cool part about marriage is after you get close to one another in that more intimate way, then you're willing to reach out into the world and impact that. Mm-hmm. And in the millennium, that's when, I mean, goodness gracious, the people of God are so messed up currently.
Sure.
We're not really having an impact on the world.
Yeah.
But the creation is going to be governed by people who are doing the will of God and loving each other at the same time.
Yes.
And it's going to be an outward expression of that relationship.
That's absolutely right. And here's a key, strong component of that. And I have advocated and talked to people over the years and have told people who are like, I want to be involved in ministry of some type, being looking more outward, like Jimmy discussed, being more outward focused and investing into the lives of other people. Here's the problem with that. If you are not strong in your marriage, in your family, with your children, you should not be going anywhere near other people. Period. You really shouldn't. Because if you have not got your stuff together in the home with your husband or wife and your children, your witness, your testimony is not what it could be. It could be viewed as hypocritical in a lot of cases if you're not real careful about what you say. So that's really, really critical to have your foundation solid. And that's what Jimmy is talking about, I think, is that the physical terms of engagement come along, the spiritual terms of engagement come along. We're supposed to be learning to love each other, and yet, unfortunately, we don't. We've been fighting against each other, sometimes verbally, sometimes with weapons, over the last 2,000 years. We haven't really been a good unified family of God, demonstrating, as Yeshua said, that might be an indication of the sign of the new covenant. What is the sign of the new covenant? If we've got circumcision at the Abrahamic level, and we have the Sabbath as the Torah level, what do we have when Yeshua comes? Is there a new sign that's given?
Just the blood.
Okay, what?
That we love one another.
That we love one another. This is how people will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. You could also throw in there baptism is kind of a sign, a little bit more of a spiritual one, but the one that is plain to see, that the initial one, the sign of circumcision, is kind of like a hidden sign. That's a very personal sign. The second one is more open. The Sabbath day is kind of a dead giveaway. Loving each other is even a more dead giveaway. It's more spiritualized, though. So I want to just back up briefly, though, because I think that you'll recognize this. Every healthy marriage needs these three things. You must have a remembrance of the first love. You must maintain physical intimacy. And you must have and grow spiritual intimacy. Now you see what I'm saying here. All parts of this covenant that is being expanded upon and grown throughout millennia are all critical components of the program. The promises made to Abraham are not yet fulfilled, right? Not thoroughly, not completely. Angela, over to Lou, please. Some of the initial aspects of the covenant promises to Abraham are still not fulfilled. Certainly not all of the program is fulfilled from the Torah. And we know for a fact that certain elements of the spiritual development of Yeshua's program are not entirely fulfilled. There are elements of all through the line that are not yet fulfilled. And the Messiah said, I have come, not a jot or a tittle is going to be removed from anything here until all is fulfilled. Lou?
Well, the remembrance of the first love, in Revelation to the churches,
Yep.
he says, you have forgotten your first love.
Absolutely.
And that's God.
That's right.
And without that remembrance,
Yep.
you might as well throw the rest away.
Exactly. That's a beautiful insight. And that goes right back to when someone asks Yeshua, what is the greatest commandment? What does he say?
Love your God with all your heart.
He is quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Now, I'm going to move forward in our study, but I'm going to bring you back to this. And there's something in this text, and you probably may be thinking about it now. If you are, just hold on to that and put it under your hat for a second, because God shows Moses himself directly, do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Every part of my covenant needs to be firmly established. Angela?
You talked about the signs of the covenant and the idea of marriage. And we just addressed the piece about throwing one part of it out to move on to the next one, that you can't do that they're all building on each other. And I just want you to all think of the way we do our rings for an example of this. Because when you get engaged, you give her the ring with a big diamond on it. And when you get married, you give her another ring. She does not throw away the one with a diamond on it. You take it to the jeweler and you weld them together.
Yeah.
And that becomes your wedding ring. And I'd like us to look at this thing with Torah and Yeshua as two things that have to be welded together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good insight and wisdom from all of you. Now, a brief story time, as I am wont to do, to just walk you through this portion so that you can just bring it to your mind, remember everything that's happening, then we'll dig in a little bit. In Exodus chapter 1, a new king, it says, who does not acknowledge Joseph, appears on the scene, and he begins to persecute the children of Israel. They have become mighty in the land. They have begun to spread. The text seems to suggest an infestation. That some of the Hebrew words that are used to describe this multiplication of the Hebrews inside Egypt is almost like using language of insect swarms. It doesn't sound flattering, but there it is. So there's great persecution. It starts off undoubtedly like most persecution does, and we'll discuss this in a moment, with small things, small liberties taken, small hands of oppression laid upon the people, and it just continues to grow until Pharaoh is saying, chuck the kids in the Nile River. Okay, so the persecution is arising, and then it intensifies in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we have the birth, the development, the trouble, and the flight of Moses, to the land of Midian. And that is because, of course, his mother gives birth to him, sees that he's a beautiful child, is able to breastfeed him and nourish him for approximately 3 months, and then can't hide him anymore, and then puts him in a teva, I believe is the correct word, an ark. That word is only used twice in the Bible, once for Noah and once for Moses. Now, here's something interesting too, is that his mother puts him into this little teva that is sealed with pitch. It actually does not say that she put this teva in the river, because we have in our minds of her putting this thing on the water and it going floating away. That is not what the Torah says. The Torah says that she places it on the edge of the river among the reeds.
Right.
Now, why would she seal it with pitch if she didn't intend to put it in the water and take it away? Well, I got to thinking about that, because I thought, well, now wait, strategically, location-wise, I'm thinking, okay, so she's got to be upriver if she's going to put this child into the water, and it's going to float downstream to where Pharaoh's family is, so that Pharaoh's daughter, can spot it and say, somebody grab that? That didn't quite make sense because of where we know that these Hebrews lived, and where the king and the Pharaoh and his family lived. It didn't quite work. But then I read the Hebrew language there, and it actually says that she placed it on the bank of the Nile River, among the reeds, probably sealed with pitch, so that it would, if the water did rise, it would be sealed and the child wouldn't be, drowned. But it also began to occur to me that it's possible that the daughter of Pharaoh, that the story of Moses being raised in the household of Pharaoh, and there's all kinds of legends and myths surrounding this, and Disney has made movies and all that stuff. And some New Testament commentators, and by that I mean like Stephen, may be interpreting those traditions, but the text of the Torah doesn't say anything about that. It does not say that he was raised in Pharaoh's household. It doesn't say that he was a prince of Egypt. It says nothing like that. It simply says that a daughter of Pharaoh took him from the river and gave him an Egyptian name. Moshe is not a Hebrew name. You've ever heard of King Tut? You know what his real name is? Tutmos. It's the same thing as Moses. Ramesses, Moses, it's the same thing. Many Egyptian names contain Moses in it. Moses is an Egyptian name. Now, it occurred to me that it's possible that certainly Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had probably many sons. He probably had many, many daughters as well. And probably not all of his daughters lived with him in the palace. They probably would have been part of little family groups spread around the kingdom. This particular woman, this particular young lady, could have been known to be a rebel against her father. And that there was a plan here of Moses' mother and his sister to get this child into the hands of a daughter of Pharaoh who was rebelling against her father. It's also possible that this daughter of Pharaoh is not a daughter of the current Pharaoh. Could have been a daughter of a previous Pharaoh. There's all kinds of questions here. It was fascinating to me to dig into that. I don't know why. It wasn't terribly spiritually edifying. It was just fascinating. And I apologize for bending your ear about that too much. But fascinating stuff if you dig a little deeper into that. In chapter 3 of Exodus, Yehovah introduces himself to Moshe. And he appoints him as his messenger. Now, Moses maintains and has a place among God's messengers that is very unique. There have only been 2 people like this in the history of the world. This is the mediator. The term mediator is used. A mediator of a covenant is much different than like a prophet or a king or a Levite or a priest. Moses is the mediator of a covenant. Who's the only other mediator in the history of the world? Yeshua, is the only other mediator. That's a very special term. It has to do with being like a bridge, a go-between between God and man. And the prophets, that's not their place. This is a very unique position. It's not something that we can spend a whole lot of time on, but I wanted to just kind of introduce you to that idea that you can begin to think about and compare and do a little research about Moses as the mediator of a covenant and Yeshua as the mediator of a covenant, and how those two things are similar and different. So consider those things. In chapter 4, we have Moses given confirming signs so that the people will know that he is speaking truth. Okay? So what are these signs? Does anybody remember the first one?
A snake,
s-
leprosy. What was the other one?
A snake, leprosy, and what else? Anybody? Help out, Jerry. What? Water into blood.
Oh, snake, leprosy, and water into blood.
Thanks, Jerry.
Nailed it.
Yes, right. Now, why do you see covenant signs given later?
God promises a sign to Moses.
God promises.
A sign to Moses that he was the right person to go and speak to Pharaoh. He said, "You'll see that this is true when you have taken my people out and you're worshiping me on the mountain."
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important one, and I'm going to deal with that one in a moment. Do you see later on God saying, "Hey, if I have some more information for you, here's how I'll do it"? Do you ever have that? Do you remember that? Have you ever heard of that? God giving this message to Moses and then giving Moses the instructions to pass along to the people. Hey, if I want to give you more information, here's how I'll do it. Do you aware of this? Not quite. If you look at Deuteronomy 13, Deuteronomy 18 and 19, which we'll get there, the confirming sign is a continuation of this idea that if God is going to give new revelation or expanded revelation, it's always going to be accompanied with signs. That's why you often have the prophets who are speaking the words of God performing signs. It's most assuredly why you have Yeshua performing signs. And in fact, the similarities between Moses and Yeshua are simply astounding. They're very, very astounding. You think that Joseph and the Messiah Yeshua are similar. They most assuredly are. That's probably the most complete and accurate foreshadowing, if you will, about the Messiah Yeshua. Moses is also a remarkably similar character. And in fact, the signs that Moses did, Yeshua did, but in reverse and from a different angle. What was the very first sign, according to John, that Yeshua did?
Change water into wine.
He turned water into wine. What is the first sign that Moses did?
Beverage of wine.
He turned water into blood. Now, I know that we have often thought about blood being a sign of life, but when you see the Nile River being turned to blood and all of the living water that people are able to drink in Egypt being turned to blood, that's death. That's a sign of death. So I would say to you that whereas Moses is bringing signs of death upon the gods of Egypt, and we'll talk about that obviously, because this is not necessarily judgment against Pharaoh, it's not necessarily judgment against the Egyptian people, it's Egyptian gods that are being judged. And the people's reliance on these Egyptian gods. Okay? And by the way, these Egyptian gods, they still exist today in your life. We just don't, we're not a superstitious people from the Stone Age who attribute things in our lives to supernatural forces. The society has long ago stripped the mystical, the metaphysical from our lives. During the Age of Reason, 16 and 1700 AD, science rose up and pulled all of the spirituality out of the Western life. Okay, so we don't think like that in the West. People in the East still do, but in the West, we don't think like that anymore. That doesn't mean that those gods aren't still there. And I don't mean the spiritual entities that represent those gods. I mean the things that those gods represent, like fertility, wealth, and happiness, fruitfulness of the earth. Do you notice when you look at the book of the Revelation, the plagues, the judgments that come in the book of Revelation happen exactly the same way as they do in Egypt, against nature. Nature seems to be falling apart in Egypt. Yeah, you have a special thing in the middle and a special thing at the end where there's fire mixed with hail in that 7th plague. And then the 10th plague where this angel of death, who knows, Yehovah, goes over Egypt and all the firstborn of man and animal are dead. Those are special. But all of the other ones are against nature. And in the book of Revelation, almost all of the plagues are against nature. Do people worship nature? Oh, you bet they do. What do you think the environmental movement is about? I can tell you for a fact that those environmentalists would be happy if more than half of you would die to make room for life on Earth to flourish again. Angela?
Just because we're being scientific now to get people to buy into it does not mean we're doing anything different.
It's entirely the same. Absolutely.
Nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. Absolutely. So that's absolutely true. So these confirming signs are given to Moses. Same confirming type signs given to Yeshua. Water into wine. Healing instead of leprosy. He's healing everyone. Now, the one with the serpent and the stick is a little unusual. It's very unusual. Did Messiah have anything to do with a stick? You could say he was impaled upon a stake. Yeah, that's some similarity. Moses took this stick and he attached a bronze serpent to it and he held it up in the wilderness, and if the people looked at it, they would be saved.
Two sticks together.
Yeah. So there's definitely some similarities there, but that third one is a little bit mystical, a little bit harder to nail down. Did you want to speak, Jimbo? I'll just get close to you.
Okay, yeah, the stick that Moses raised up was actually probably a standard of one of the dead family leaders who had been bitten by a snake and had died, and so it probably was in the shape of a cross, so it could have a flag on it.
Interesting.
What died, the family member or the snake?
The family.
Here's just a little tidbit, just kind of interesting. That when Moses meets God at the burning bush and he is told by God to throw his rod down on the ground, it becomes a snake. And the Hebrew word there is nachash, which is typically translated throughout the text as a serpent. But when he meets with Pharaoh and Pharaoh's magicians and he throws his stick on the ground, the text does not say that it becomes a nachash. It says something entirely different. What does it say? Does anybody know?
Where are you?
Oh, I'm not actually, this is just one of the things that I'm pulling out. This is not happening until like chapter 6. Just pulling it out here because of the signs being given. And this is just a little nugget that's quite interesting. I think it's representative. What's that?
Wasn't it dragon or something like
It's
that?
like dragon or crocodile.
Yeah.
I think that one of the only other places that word is used is in the book of Ezekiel, I think, and it's there translated as crocodile. That Moses throws his staff on the ground and it becomes a crocodile and eats the other serpents that the magicians throw down, which is quite interesting. because of the imagery that brings forth. Okay, the serpent we know and associate with like the adversary, the devil, or something. The crocodile, the dragon, could also be interpreted in that way, and yet, and some scholars attribute the fact that it turned into a crocodile as somehow being associated with Egypt, because the Nile River is full of crocodiles. Yeah, they're very, very nasty animals. Angela?
It's a reptile with legs.
It is a reptile with legs. That's an interesting insight. So I don't know. Look into that if you want to make a note to yourself and do a little bit of research, because it's quite interesting. Did you want to mention something, Tracy?
Yeah, just in that section when he's showing him those signs before he goes to his people. This is just really cool to me. But it says, Yahweh says to Moses, "And it shall be, if they will not believe you and will not listen to the voice of the first sign, that they will believe the latter sign." When you look at the Hebrew, the word sign is Aleph Tav. So if they don't, and we know Aleph Tav is the first and the last, and that's what Yahweh says of himself, that's what Yehoshua says of himself in Revelation. So if they will not believe the voice of the first and the last, the first Aleph Tav, then they will believe the voice of the last Aleph Tav.
Fascinating.
So it's a big picture thing. That is chapter
4.
Chapter 4, verse 8.
Yeah, that's
and 9.
fascinating.
8 and 9.
Fascinating. Make a note. Make a note. And we'll continue to just pull out a couple of interesting things that you can make a note of, but I'm going to move forward just a little bit. In chapter 5, we have Pharaoh being introduced to Yehovah, because Moses approaches him and says, "Let my people go," says Yehovah. And Pharaoh, of course, says, "I don't know who Yehovah is. Never heard of this God. I ain't going to let your people go." So he rejects the message, and the persecution of the Hebrews intensifies. Fascinating discussion there that's coming up. Because at the end of chapter 5, God tells Moses, "Go in and perform these signs before Pharaoh and demand that he let my people go." And of course, Pharaoh says, "I ain't letting your people go. And moreover, you can make that brick without the straw.
Get your own straw.
Go get your own straw." And suddenly the persecution and the back-breaking labor and the plight of the people intensifies. And then Moses goes back to God at the very end of chapter 5 and says, "Man, what is going on here? I came to Egypt and I did what you told me to do, and you have not saved your people at all." Moses is frustrated, and the people are frustrated.
And they're getting ready to kill me.
And they're getting ready to rebel. It says also that the people were short of spirit. Fascinating insight. That is at like chapter 5, verse 28. It's right at the very end of chapter 5. Right at the very end, because right at the very beginning of chapter 6, God pipes up and says, "I know exactly what I'm doing. Now you will see what I'm about to do." So this was all part of God's plan, that he goes, says his piece, the Pharaoh rejects it, the persecution intensifies, and the people cry out. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The people are encouraged, though. And then in chapters 7 through 9 is when we begin to have the judgments start. This is when the judgments actually start. And the Nile is turned to blood, and then we have frogs and gnats. We don't quite get to past 7. The 7th plague happens at the end of this Torah portion, and things get a little wonky after that in the next Torah portion. Okay, so that's an overview of both Parashats, Shemot and Vaera. Now, I want to talk to you about a couple of things. If you back up a little bit to Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, I want to read this little section to you that starts right at the beginning of this chapter in Shemot. And it says in Exodus 1:15, "Moreover, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was called Shiphrah and the other Puah, and said, 'When you attend the Hebrew women and see them giving birth, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. However, the midwives were God-fearing women, so they didn't do as the king of Egypt ordered, but they let the boys live. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives and demanded of them, "Why have you done this, and let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "It's because the Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. They go into labor and give birth before the midwife arrives." Therefore God prospered the midwives, and the people continued to multiply and grow very powerful. Indeed, because the midwives feared God, he made them founders of families. Now, I wanted to bring this out to you because I think there's a very good spiritual nugget here that is very useful for us. And that is that these women feared God more than they feared the king. And they received blessing and protection because of it. Do you think that it's possible that the Pharaoh could have destroyed these women, killed them? Certainly seems likely. They make some lame excuse, it sounds like, and he just says, okay. And the text goes on to tell us that God, because these women were God-fearing and refused the wicked order of Pharaoh, engaged in a little act of civil disobedience, they were granted families of their own. Gracie?
Well, they didn't just do civil disobedience. They did the civil disobedience, but then they lied about it.
They did indeed. That's a big one, and you know there's a big debate in Hebrew and Christian literature regarding lying to save life. That's a tough one. Theoretically, according to the letter of the law, lying is a sin. But in the spirit of the law, I would say, lie to save life. I would. I can't tell you that I wouldn't.
But isn't the command not to bear false witness? And that's, I think, different than...
Yeah, there's definitely a command to bear false witness. I don't know that particular... I mean, isn't lying one of the 10 Commandments?
Bearing false witness is what
Okay, so bearing false... Yeah, that's a good point. And I think...
Court thing.
Yeah, that's certainly more of a court thing. But if you're hauled in before the king and he says, hey, so-and-so, and they say, no, so-and-so, that's bearing false witness.
Well,
if you want to look at it that way.
I was kind of thinking about when Messiah said, well, you're walking with someone in the way, agree with them, or he's going to turn you into the magistrates or something like that. So there's some kind of...
Yes, making peace with someone that you might have litigation pending to try and work it out amongst yourselves before you get to court so that you hopefully you can work it out amongst yourselves. I mean, that's just like Yeshua saying, go to your brother privately if you can work out that issue. If he doesn't listen to you, then it's going to have to be escalated.
I thought that particular one was regarding people trying to persecute you, though, like wrongfully. I could be wrong, but that's what was my understanding.
I'm not certain exactly about the exact context of that. That would be something to look into. Would somebody else have a hand up, Jerry?
The one I always think about is David and Jonathan.
Yes.
When they deceived Saul about, well, he lied that one night about where he was, said he was with his father and brother.
Right.
I don't remember where he was at. But
right.
Then they made up the story about shooting the arrow either before or after.
Yeah.
So that was definitely deception.
There are definitely several examples in the Torah, in the prophets, in the writings with people who lie to protect the life of someone else. Huh?
Even Christ himself, when they were going in the temple that one time, near the
told
end of
his brothers that I'm not going up.
They were going to go up to the temple, and he said, "No, I'm not going to go up to the temple." But as soon as they got out of sight, zip up to the temple he went. So, I mean, what would you call that?
That would be prevarication.
Green while they're in the way.
That's right.
The lady with the scarlet thread in the window.
Yes, Rahab the barkeep.
Yeah. I would
Yeah.
like to spare somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. So, yeah, very much. But I think our fear must be correctly placed. We must fear God more than we fear the king, civil authority, friends, family members, whatever it is. because your fear that gets misplaced can become idolatry. Fear can very easily become idolatry if you don't rein it in. And you know, being really persistent regarding knowing, understanding, and doing the will of God as opposed to anybody else's will, especially your own, brings great blessing and I think great protection. We see many examples of people fearing God. Rahab the harlot certainly feared the Hebrews and their God more than she feared her own civil magistrates at great cost to herself. Her and her entire family could have been killed for assisting these Hebrew spies, but she risked it because she feared the God of the Hebrews and the Hebrews themselves more than she feared these people. Tremendous blessing and protection arises in most instances when you see people doing something indicating that they fear God more than something else. That's what that ought to and certainly should encourage us to be fearless, because fearing God eliminates fear. Frankly, it does. Tracy?
Just a couple examples, like even in the Exodus, those who had the faith and trusted to put the blood on the doorpost over Pharaoh's command, because he said, "Who's Yahovah that I should obey him?" He protected and rescued them from the mighty hand of Pharaoh. And then again in Nebuchadnezzar's day with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he said, "What God is going to save you out of my hand?" And they say, "Well, we're not going to bow. Even if he doesn't save us, he can, but we're not going to bow." And he again preserves them. But if not.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think we just need to remember always that fearing God is so much more powerful than any other fear that you might have in your life. Amen. And if you could operate in every element of your life without fear, I think you'd really be amazed at what you could do in your life if you feared nothing but God. The fear of reprisal or anything, and I'm not even just necessarily talking about some spiritual thing where you're going to go out and convert a bunch of people, like, you know, the what's his name, who some great evangelist. It could be just anything that you're willing to tackle in righteousness in your life could bring forth a lot of blessing and protection. So just consider that. Moving forward a little bit, at the end of that section, it says that after this, when the Hebrew midwife plan failed, and these people just kept multiplying, that he came up with a new plan. And Pharaoh said in Exodus 1:22, he gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born, throw it in the river, but let all the girls live." Jimmy?
Reminds me of the bad guy that wanted to kill all the baby boys in Bethlehem.
It's very, very similar. That's just one of the similarities between Yeshua and Moses, is they both were tried to be killed as children. Another one is that they were rejected by their brethren and had to flee out of the land. Moses fled out of the land. Jesus fled out of the land. Moses fled to a different land. Married a Gentile bride, came back 40 years later. All kinds of interesting parallels. But so when this happens, the persecution is intensifying. This persecution. This is the first Holocaust, if you want to call it that, and it very much is. This is the first world Holocaust, and I want to point out to you a couple things here. How does this relate to our world? Are you persecuted? You certainly are. Certainly not to this degree. Certainly not yet. It could happen in America. It may not happen in America. I don't know. It could. It could. I mean, you can certainly see how it could. But I wanted to just briefly kind of walk you through this progression that I see, especially in our own country, of being marginalized, criticized, and then demonized. This is kind of like the progression that you see in cultures that begin to turn on themselves and turn on each other. You can see it in the Holocaust in Germany. You can see it in some of the civil upheavals during the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. All of these societal developments where people turn on each other, sometimes in a religious sense, sometimes not. It usually happens in this way, that when looking at it from an American perspective of people who are religious, people who are Christian, people who are Jews, it doesn't really matter. The religious people in our society have been relegated. I know I was talking to one of my children the other day, and we talked about how back in the 1980s, this is not terribly long ago, okay, if they were holding congressional hearings about inappropriate language in music. Okay? Congressional hearings about inappropriate language in music. And if you had a curse word on network television, you would be fined thousands and thousands of dollars by the Federal Communications Commission and be taken off the air potentially. In the 1980s, that's 20, 30 years ago. It's not that long. It's not 40, is it? Jerry?
In the 1960s, they wouldn't even film Elvis Presley below the waist.
This is true. Elvis Presley was a horrible scandal in the 1960s. So you can see that early on in our society in America, religion and religious people and religious principles were dominant. So dominant that it was almost to a fault, to where you're like Salem witch trials, burning people at the stake kind of stuff. If you have a Christmas tree, you are ostracized and kicked out of the community because they didn't do Christmas in those days. So we have we have a serious devolution, I would say, from the religious and the Christian, Judeo-Christian principles ruling this society, and the people who were wicked and secular were hiding in the closet, and certainly were not going to speak up. They committed their acts of evil in secret. Okay? But now it's entirely flipped on its head, to where the religious people, we have learned over this last period of time, we have been marginalized. That the wicked in society have begun to rise up and shake their fists and say, demanding thus and such, and the religious people backed off and said, okay, it begins with making fun of them, criticizing them, and then demonizing them. And we'll get to demonizing in just a moment, Lou.
Well, the first thing, if I said a curse word, my dad heard me, he'd hit me. But our morals. I mean, without religion, it's our morals. What's right and what's wrong. Mm-hmm. We don't
even know anymore.
No.
We don't even know anymore.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's kind of hard to tell exactly how long an inch is if they don't teach it in school anymore and all the rulers have been thrown out. Everybody has their idea of how much an inch is, but if you don't ever look at a ruler and they're not teaching that in school anymore, you might have a problem. Tammy has taken the microphone away from you, Lou. I apologize.
I was just going to say a couple things, but we are persecuted today, and it might not be a persecution that maybe we're getting stoned or we're doing all that, but we are persecuted because if you say something, you say you're a believer. If Facebook is a good example. If I even just say I'm a Christian in certain circles, oh my goodness, I've had to get rid of friends because they have attacked me and call me all kinds of names because I say read the Bible, or read your Bible, and then we get in a fight. So it's best not do that. And so, I've gotten rid of a ton of them. Yeah. But then the other thing I was going to say is John and I were in the bookstore today, over in Tempe, and we were so blown away. The Christianity section used to be like a good section, like probably 4 or 5 rows. We went today, and I tell you, it's one bookshelf.
Wow.
One narrowed
Doesn't
down to
surprise me.
one tiny bookshelf. I was like, whoa, not even a row. But rows of spirituality, anything that had to do with
Self-improvement.
any of that stuff. Yeah, all over the place. And it was so sad. And, another section that is new that I've never seen in the bookstore, except for today, was a section on your sex.
Sexual confusion.
Yeah, and that is crazy. And then when your kids go to school, now Stephen hasn't been in school for a few years, and now he goes back to ASU, and the teacher, the first thing out of his mouth is, I'm gay, this is the way I relate, and there is no such thing as truth, and there is no such thing as morals. And so, wow, what do you do with that? Because if you speak up, and this is persecution, if my son speaks up because he doesn't agree, then he gets a bad grade. And so,
I've heard this from other people too.
yeah, I've heard it, but I haven't lived it.
And this is
until
when
recent.
and this is
friend of mine
when
has seen
you really need to exercise some real wisdom and decide what stance are you going to take, and in what conditions and what circumstances, what are you going to say and how are you going to say it, and are you willing to sacrifice and suffer the consequences if you do. Lou, did you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say, when I grew up, there was a standard. I mean, there was a way way I was brought up.
Yeah.
And, I started school every morning with the Lord's Prayer, or whatever you want to call it, and a scripture reading and Pledge of Allegiance. Now you don't do anything.
Yeah. And that's in public school.
And that's in public school.
Yeah. Jimmy, did you want to say something? And then Angela?
Everybody says there is no truth. That is in itself a truth statement.
Yeah.
What an idiot.
That's what I said. I said the same thing.
Absolutely. Angela?
I think that throughout our lives, we're all faced with some difficult questions that we have to answer. But if you can't get past the first and easiest question, is it a boy or a girl? You will never get to the other questions. You keep them confused with the very first question, and it's key. You can see why it is so key to confusion just in general.
Yeah.
You just need to look in the mirror.
Yeah. It's pretty.
I know. It's an easy question.
It's pretty easy to see. Yeah, if you want to look. Did
So,
you want to say something? Oh,
yeah, I was just thinking about all this, just made me think about Messiah when he's talking about these end times in Matthew 24. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. I think that's what we're seeing now. For
absolutely,
sure.
absolutely. Gracie, you can make one more comment on this if you like.
I just always think when we're talking about, or in a group, or just in the family, talking about like this, is you have, what's the animals thing? We didn't come from animals, but what's
Yes.
his name told us we did. Evolution.
Yes,
Thank
sure,
you.
sure.
Evolution was accepted, and anybody who said anything about it was put down, and now we are just absolutely worse than put down with it. And then you had the O'Hare lady who came in and took God out of the schools, and they've just proceeded to kick God out of everything. Went through the love time when everybody did whatever, and it's just gotten worse and worse. And this is just what God had said would happen.
Yeah,
It really
absolutely.
is. It's scary to live through it.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's certainly uncomfortable. But I want to tell you this. Remember what we talked about previously. Fear God more than anyone else. And I'm not guaranteeing you protection, but we see multiple examples of it in the text, all over the text, of people who are willing to stand up for what is right and take righteous action are blessed and protected. Now here's the catch. You might look at the example of Phineas, who saw an act of evil and took a spear and rammed it right through these two people.
My favorite.
Now, was that a righteous action? God certainly seemed to think so. God certainly seemed to think so. There was no deliberation. There was no calling of witnesses. There was no turning them over to the judges to have a righteous ruling and figuring out who did what and what is the punishment. It was a zealous person who stood up and just put these dogs down.
It's a zealous shish kebabbing.
A zealous shish kebabbing. Now, what's remarkable is that you have seen this in American society. What would you say was a modern example of somebody being zealous and doing something like this? One thing that comes to my mind is people who get really zealous about abortion and decide to blow up abortion clinics. That hasn't happened in a long time, but it did in the 80s and the 90s, where some soul decided that this is a wicked perversion that must stop, and I'm going to go and blow up an abortion clinic. Angela, and then Jerry?
Well, I think that Pincus's deal worked when it was the first act, but when we've gotten this far down the line, you can't all of a sudden turn into Pincus and think that it's going to work out well.
No. Well, and that's where I'm glad you said that, because that's exactly where I'm going here.
That would have been fine at the very first, but to stop.
But that wasn't the very first.
Yeah.
Moses is the very first.
Yeah, I'm saying.
And they were in the presence of God. They were in His camp, and now we're in dispersion. We're in someone else's land. So I think
True.
there is a difference there as well.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to comment on the wise as serpents, gentle as doves.
Please.
A great example is Messiah. Well, he's the one that said it, but that's what he was doing. When they come and test him, why are you testing me? I'm as wise as the serpent, because the serpent's the one that sent these people to come and test him. Mm-hmm. So you have to have that wisdom, which only comes from the Word, because you won't be able to tell when he's doing these things if you don't have that discernment.
Yeah.
And gentle as doves is how he reacts and treats other people. I mean, he was a gentle, merciful.
And I think it's telling also that he did provoke them on occasion. He got them into a murderous rage by some of the things that he said, but then what would happen when they were ready to grab him? He would disappear. He would hide. He wasn't ready to confront them at that point. Okay? Now, he confronted them and he willingly died, and I'm not saying you should or should not do that. What I am saying is he was gentle and yet wise as a serpent.
The wrath of man cannot work the righteousness of God.
Thank you, sir.
It always screws it up.
Yes, absolutely.
Goes too far, twists it.
It does, yes, absolutely. That's a good insight. So, yes, don't get confused about your own righteousness and that you're Pincus. But if God calls you to be Pincus, use wisdom and guidance. I don't want to see you guys just behave foolishly. I'd like to see you use wisdom and save your own soul and the soul of many other people who see your good deeds and give glory to your Father on the day of visitation. I'm going to give one comment to Jerry, and then we're going to move forward on this, because we could talk about this. This is a hot topic, of course. Jerry?
Don't be like some of the old prophets. I think Ezekiel was one where he had to lay down on his side for 6 months or a year or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Just pray God don't ask you to do that.
Yeah, well, you know what? And we don't.
might
We
ask
also
you to put your
don't want to
underwear in a
be.
rock.
We
Come back
also
and get
don't
it
want to
later.
be like that Israelite king who said, "Hey, at least there's going to be peace and prosperity in my day." That always struck me as being the wrong thing to say. In any event, here's the example of Moses getting filled with righteous indignation and taking it upon himself to perform some zealous act of righteousness from Exodus 2:11. One day when Moshe was a grown man, he went out to visit his kinsmen, and as he was watching them struggling at forced labor, and he saw an Egyptian strike a Hebrew. And he looked this way and that, and when he saw that no one else was around, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrew men fighting each other, and he said to the one in the wrong, he said, "Why are you hitting your companion?" And he retorted, "Well, who appointed you to be a ruler and a judge over us?" Have you heard that before? They said the same thing to Yeshua. You intend to kill me the way you killed that Egyptian? And of course Moshe became frightened, and clearly he thought the matter has become known. The people are talking. Everybody knows that I killed this Egyptian dude. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he tried to have Moshe put to death, but Moshe fled from before Pharaoh to live in the land of Midian. Now, there's a perfect example of pulling a pincus. Moshe pulled a pincus, and it didn't turn out so well. He ended up fleeing for his life and spending 40 years in the desert with Uncle Yithro. So I'm going to move forward a little bit. For further study, continue to compare and contrast Moshe and Yeshua. Fantastic study right there. And I want to read this little section to you because this is quite fascinating. In Exodus 3, starting in verse 9, Exodus 3, starting in verse 9 says this, "And now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me, and indeed I have seen the oppression with which Egypt has been oppressing them. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, from Egypt." Yet Moses said to God, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the sons of Israel from Egypt?" And then he said, "I shall be with you, and this will be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you bring the people forth from Egypt, you shall serve Elohim on this mountain." Now Moses said to Elohim, "Behold, when I am coming to the sons of Israel, and I say to them, 'The God of our fathers has sent me to you,' and then they're going to say to me, 'Well, what is his name?' What do I say to them?" And then God spoke to Moses, "I am that I am. I am just as I am. I will be what I will be." You can interpret that in multiple ways. And he said, "Thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" And God said further to Moses, "Thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, Yud He Vav He," however you want to pronounce that, "the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name for the eon, and this is the remembrance of me for generation after generation. Go, and you will gather the elders of the sons of Israel and say to them, Yehovah, the God of your fathers, appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I have noticed, indeed noticed, you and what is being done to you in Egypt." Simply stunning portion of Scripture here, with so many key and important things being said there. But I need to wrap this up. I want to point out to you one thing that Mikey was talking about previously, which is what is the confirming sign of this thing, and when does it occur? That God says, this is the sign for you that you can be encouraged by and you can be strengthened by. When this is all over, you're going to meet with me on the mountain. Now, doesn't that sound backwards? It's like, well, no, wait a minute. You're asking me to go and do this tremendous thing, put my life at risk, put everyone else's life at risk, and the sign is after it's all over? That doesn't make any sense. Now, some people have said, no, wait a minute. There's also a pre-sending out sign. I mean, he met God at the burning bush, and he showed him to turn the serpent, turn the stick into a serpent, and the hand and the blood, and he's talking to God. And I would say, yes, both of these things are true. And yet, God says this is the confirming sign that it will happen when it's over. I think there's a huge lesson here that many times God is saying to you, get to it. You'll know it when it's over. Trust me.
That'd be awesome.
Just trust
We'll
me.
laugh about this.
Just trust me. It's going to be okay. You will take my people out. You're going to succeed, and you will meet me at this mountain. He has told him in advance what is going to happen. Do you think, for example, that if if Yoshebel, Moses' mother, had known in advance what was going to happen, that she could have gotten rid of a lot of her fears and terrors about what she's doing with this child and putting him on the bank of the river and crocodiles could get him and God knows what's going to happen to him? What if God had said to her, look, put him in the river. The daughter of Pharaoh is going to come by. He's going to be raised in the household of Pharaoh. He's going to be taken care of. He's going to rise up. He's going to become a great prophet. He's going to go to the land of Midian. You'll miss him for a while, but he's going to come back. He's going to rescue you all. What if she had known all of that in advance? Do you think that she might have had a different perspective on life? That's the key. Moses knew in advance what's going to happen. Go. He's going to reject you. He's not going to let it happen, but he will take them out. You will take them out with a strong hand. And not only that, you're going to plunder them. And I'll wreck the gods of Egypt, and you will meet me on this mountain. Believe me, you'll have the confirming covenant at the end. Gracie?
There's still the honor and the blessing of trusting, because they hadn't seen it yet.
Right.
So there's still a reason why God didn't tell Moses' mom, but he told her what to do, and she did it because she trusted God.
Yeah. So Moses has to trust God. But God is gracious, and he does give Moses some signs before he even starts. But that's just for Moses. The people are going to have to trust in Moses as God's messenger, and in Aaron, God's prophet.
Everything you're saying is just like, I'm just seeing a way bigger picture. It's really like what you just said. Maybe you're going to go there, but
I would love to. I don't know how much time we have.
Just that what Lou said is that we know he wins in the end. Well, he's given us that same promise. I will dwell with you. This is on the mountain. You will be there. Are we trusting that? This is just the in-between.
Yep.
And that's what we need to be looking forward to. And like you just said, but we have to trust in the Messiah now.
Yep.
Not Moses, but the
Right.
Messiah.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. You have to remember he's already told you what happens at the end. Just exactly like Lou said. And therefore, we can have no fear. We can see that God will take us, will elevate us above, just like the ark was floated above the surface of the water. As everything, death and destruction is happening, it doesn't matter how wild that water was, raging and people dying underneath. However high that water went, the ark was just resting on top of it. That's what you got to remember.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and perfect love casts out fear. Doesn't it say that?
It does indeed. Absolutely. So, bush and mountain. You got a pre-confirming sign and you got a post-confirming sign. Remember it, okay? Questions, Moshe's questions and God's answers. You can jot these down, but they're quite fascinating indeed. And I'm going to say, here's what Moses' first question is. Who am I? What is God's answer to that? You're nobody. I'm going to do the work. I'm going to be with you. Don't worry about who you are. Worry about who I am. That's exactly what he told him. Moses said, who am I that I'm supposed to go and do this? He's like, you're nobody. I am going to be with you. You're not the important part of this
I do
equation.
the works, and that's something we need to understand too, is that he does the works. We just have to listen and follow
He needs a willing partner.
Right.
And this is where it gets tricky, because the next objection, not the next objection, but the next question is, and this is really critical, Moses' next question is, who are you? Says to God, who are you? First he says, who am I? And then he says, who are you? Well, I am who I am. And I think that a good way to interpret that, in my mind, this is what I think to myself, is I am the God who actually exists. I'm not one of these demonic spirits that's running around Egypt demanding the worship of humans, or some figment of people's imaginations. I am the God who actually exists. I am a God. Everything else that you're thinking of in your mind is not a God. And I'm going to show you that all those gods that you're thinking of are not actually gods. I am God. And I think that's what he means when he says, I Eyeh Asher Eyeh. I am the one who exists. Okay? So that's what Moses says next. Who are you? And there are so deep spiritual principles of you needing to know, who are you? Okay? Because the more you know about who he is, the more you care, the less you care about who you are. Because you realize that your part in this is quite small. But the next point is, he says, what if I go to the people and they don't believe me? What if is a question that you almost never want to ask yourself. Because what if almost always has a fear attached to it that is not attached to God. We always say in our minds, what if? Those fears are almost always external and around us. Those are not the fears. That's not the fear of heaven. Whenever you say, what if? Okay? Don't say to yourself, what if, in any circumstance. Okay? Don't say, what if I get sick? What if my husband or wife dies? What if I lose my job? What if persecution arises and I get beat up and stoned to death? What if the economy collapses? What if Donald Trump is impeached? What if Donald Trump doesn't get reelected? What if Nancy Pelosi takes over the world? Don't what if yourself, because then the what if is always an expression of fear that is around you and not above you. Okay? And Moses is questioning, what if I go to these people of yours and they don't believe me? Then God tells him, this is why I have given you the signs to prove that I sent you. Okay? What is your sign that God sent you? You have love for one another. And you're full of the Spirit of God. Remember those things. The final thing is, I just don't want to. Hey, you know what, God? Just send whoever you want. Well, what am I talking to you for? Just send whoever you want. This is when God's anger burns against Moses, is when he has an unwilling participant. Don't be an unwilling participant, because then the anger of God burns against you. Once you become obstinate, rebellious, and you're saying, I just don't want to. He doesn't put up with that. He needs a willing participant. Okay? Those are some key questions. He said, finally, just choose someone else. Just don't do that. Okay? Now, here is something that I want to point out to you. This will be one of the final things here. We must have a balanced view of God, and this is so critical, and it goes right back to the very beginning thing that I said at the beginning of this discussion. In Exodus 4, verse 24, it says, Now on the way, at a place where they stopped for the night, Yehovah met Moshe and tried to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife and cut off the foreskin of her son and touched it to Moses' feet and said, Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So Yehovah let him alone. At that time, she said, a bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. Now, isn't this unusual? Most unusual. People have been puzzled by this forever. And I want to point out two things to you that I think this teaches us. Number one, God is about to show up on the large scene of the world. You realize, of course, that these acts of God that he is about to perform in Egypt made him known in the entire world until now. This is one of the huge things in the history of the world that has happened that everybody knows about. Okay? Even today, they're still talking about it. What happened in Egypt? I mean, what's one of the biggest things now that we're talking about? The real Mount Sinai, and this really happened, and there are chariot parts strewn at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, and on the Nueva Beach, and I mean, it's just, this event in the history of the world is huge, okay? Now, God is about to show up and be gracious and merciful. His people are not faithful. They're probably many, if not most of them, involved in idolatry in Egypt. Probably don't even remember their God of their ancestors from way back when. Why do you think that Moses just said to him, well, they're going to ask me who you are? Well, don't they know? No, they don't. Now, those Hebrew midwives were God-fearing. Maybe they didn't even know exactly what they were fearing. It was just the God of our ancestors. We don't know who he is, but we know that there's something connected back there. So God is about to show up and be most merciful and gracious and institute this new covenant with his people. And he's telling Moses, you must go back. You must be circumcised. That's taking him back to the previous covenant. That's why I said, do not go past go. Do not collect $200. You can't move forward with the new covenant unless you have integrated the previous covenant. Do you see that picture here? He's telling Moses, you did not circumcise your son. You can't be my mediator. You can't go and talk to my people about this, about me coming to be gracious and merciful and saving them if you haven't even lived up to the previous covenant that I established with Abraham and his descendants. You can't take part in this. Now, what am I saying to you? That you must go back and observe the Torah? Yes, I am. You really should, because this is what it is telling us. Moses himself was not able to go forward until he had made things right with the previous covenant. Why do you think that John the Baptist rose up in the wilderness, the prophet, Moses and Aaron, Yeshua and John the Baptist? John the Baptist shows up before Yeshua and says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That means get yourself right with what had come previously, because the new revelation, the new expansion is coming. If you're not right with the previous one, you can't move forward with the new one. This is what is happening in this section. And I think it's also part 2, subpart, but also critically important. Moses needed to understand that God means business. Yes, he is loving and kind and merciful and gracious, but he means business. These are life and death situations that he's dealing with. You go and circumcise your children, and then you continue on your journey.
And that's actually how he proclaims his name to Moses later. He tells him he's loving, merciful, lists all these things, but he doesn't leave out the part about how I judge my people. And
That's right.
So that's
the people who hate me to the third and the fourth generation. Yeah.
Visiting the iniquity of the people.
Absolutely. Gracie?
So how do you get to the point from there to where we are now, where we don't need to have the circumcision?
You must be circumcised. You must have a circumcised heart, which is the whole point of circumcision to begin with. If you'll remember from our studies in Genesis of a couple of years ago, when we talked about this mystical thing about circumcision, that it was really always a picture of having a circumcised heart. That's what I would say. Does that help? I'm not telling anybody...
What made his heart not circumcised compared to what we have our hearts circumcised?
Tracy, would you like to answer that?
I don't know that people would like what I say, so I'll just let you handle it.
No, would you repeat the question for me, Gracie?
He had to have an actual physical circumcision.
Right.
Which means that he couldn't just get by with...
My heart is right
my
before you.
heart is right before you.
Yeah.
So where did that change? Is that when Christ came and made the actual...
Well, that is a very good question, and I would suggest to you... Yeah, you're not going to like what I say either. I don't think that ever did change.
Yeah.
I don't think that ever did change. Did Jesus come around and say you no longer need to circumcise your children? Not as far as I know. Did Paul come along and say, don't circumcise your children?
But circumcision was a sign that was God's covenant between him and man. I mean, in the was it the Levite generation, wasn't it? The Jewish people. That's the difference.
It doesn't say that. It says if you want to be a member of his congregation, a member of his family.
Now you know women don't get circumcised.
That is correct. This is only for males.
So I will put in my.
Throw in your 2 shekels.
So Paul actually took one of his
He took Timothy.
fellows, Timothy, and had him circumcised before going and speaking to the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the same type of thing we're seeing here with Moses.
True.
And for me personally, I'm not a man, so I can't say for sure, but as I came to the Word and I came to study things, I would go, you know what? I feel like this is something I need to do. And just letting the Spirit convict me of those things. But it is a heart matter, first and foremost, just like every command we should be keeping is a heart matter first.
It's spiritual. It's spiritual. But is it also physical? That's a tough question because most people will say, are you literally telling me that a person who is a Christian male should be circumcised? I'm not telling you that.
Right.
The Bible is. Okay? But you're saying, wait, there's some stuff in the New Testament where Paul says absolutely do not be circumcised. Is that what he's saying? Because you got to remember when we were reading in the book of Acts, repeatedly we noticed that Paul saying circumcision is not talking about a literal physical circumcision. To Paul, circumcision means converting to Judaism. Does a Christian need, and this is what they're fighting about in Acts chapter 15 and Acts chapter 24, they're continuously fighting. Do these Gentiles who are converting to worship our God and our Messiah, do they need to be circumcised? Paul said no, but what were they talking about? They were talking about, do they need to become Jews? And Paul will tell us, no. They do not. Let every man in the situation that he was born into stay there. Did he say, don't be literally, physically circumcised? No, he did not. But he did say, do not be circumcised in the sense that they used it in the first century, which is, do not convert to Judaism. That is ridiculous. That is not correct. Judaism was perverted then as it's perverted now. Okay? Don't convert to Judaism in order to worship the God of Judaism. Now, am I telling you to go and be circumcised if you're not? No, I'm not. That is none of my business what's going on in your pants. That is not my business. That is between you and God.
And the debate was all about to be saved, circumcised to be saved.
Indeed.
There's no command you should keep to be saved.
Right.
Other than loving the Lord your God, and letting the Spirit inform those commands.
Indeed.
And that's the difference. And we can take this and flip it with the Christian version of baptism.
Mm-hmm. It's the same thing.
It's the same thing. Mm-hmm. We just don't look at it that way because we're not Jewish. But flip it and say, okay, you got to be baptized to be saved.
Okay, now hold on a second. Not Jerry.
Nope.
No, not Jerry. Daryl, and then Jerry.
I was going to reference Colossians 2:11, where it says a circumcision made without hands.
Yes, this is the spiritual circumcision.
of the heart.
I think this is overall the heart issue. As I have said, it is a heart issue very much. The physical is definitely of lesser importance, but I don't even know that I want to say that, because the spiritual and the physical are connected. It's like Angela said about the engagement ring and the wedding ring. They're supposed to be fused together. It's like I said previously, you go ahead and try to live out your marriage without ever having sex again. See how that works out for you. That don't work. You really need to have you're not going to have much of a marriage if you're not engaging each other physically. It's just a fact. Can you still have a marriage and engage each other spiritually? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Is it what it could be? No, it's not.
I think this has to do more with reproduction.
It
Well,
certainly
with the
does.
male, it certainly does. I mean, that's the most obvious thing. But with trees, they produce fruit. And if you'll notice, it's not Moses that's having the issue. It's his children. It's his fruits that needed to be circumcised. And so maybe it has something to do with the furtherance of this, the propagation of God's kingdom, than it does, us like making appointments for the surgeon now, because I think sometimes we get, I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. Let's leave it there. I think that's good. That's a good way to end it. Lou, do you want to say something? You don't really, do you?
Yes, I do. John 3:16.
God loved the world, and He gave His only begotten Son so that whoever believed in Him would have eternal life and not perish. What would you say about that?
I would say that's
That's the final word.
that's the
Fair enough. Fair enough, buddy. That's a good word. Let us pray.